guess we're ready now. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Scott.
It's always fun because I get to listen to you guys for like 10 minutes and I'm just sitting there watching. So I feel like a fly on a wall. It's technology at its finest. Well, everybody, welcome to our live stream. I've been very excited about this one for multiple reasons. I'm going to do a quick introduction to the crew. And Peter, yes, what you were talking about, I heard you, and that's exactly where we're going to go. So first, I will introduce to my whatever direction, Vanessa, who will be interfacing with the crowd. Say hi to Vanessa, everybody. And Tom Campbell, of course, everybody should know Tom by this point, but if you don't, he's a former NASA physicist who is, as we say now, gathering evidence about the virtual reality. I love that term. And Peter Sage, I got to say, stop it. You're an entrepreneur. You're a marathon runner. You do TED Talks. You're raising the bar too high, my friend. We other men have things we want to do to impress people, and you seem to do them all. So, Peter, I've been watching your videos, not only the ones you've done with Tom, which have been amazing, but I saw some of your TED Talks. Very excited to have you on. Really, the thing that I saw that I connected with you on was that this thing that changed my life was really taking responsibility for everything that comes at you in your life, accepting the unacceptable. And that's really had a big impact on my life. So I really want to get to you first, talk a little bit about you. And from what I gather, it sounds like we're all kind of on the same page here. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Cool. Well, thank you. And I think a lot of the early sort of accomplishments and the sort of tinsel around the resume were a throwback to my ego days of, as I say, certainly wanting to impress everybody, and girls in bars and all of that kind of fun stuff that we sort of grow up thinking that, life is about, how do I prove myself? Ultimately, how do I avoid the fear that I'm not enough, which I think is a primary fear that most human beings have. And, I found my gift. Everybody has gifts. Mine was found initially in the sort of expression of entrepreneurship. But that was really making up for the fact that I wasn't very academic. I'm one of those crazy guys that dropped out of school at 16 and like a rat up a drain pipe, because I realized that the way the school system is currently enshrined in its agendas doesn't really support modern 21st century life. School essentially teaches you two things, which is how to pass tests and work for somebody else. And neither of those were on my agenda. And so I went out and I really fell into, to quote Jim Rohn, personal growth and development, where he said that formal education may help you make a living. And that's not guaranteed these days. Whereas informal education will help you make a fortune. Now, I use the word fortune there, not so much in its monetary terms, but certainly in terms of fulfillment. And an expansion, being able to interface with life at a level that's far more rewarding than sitting there and for somebody like me, which, very opposite side of the coin to Tom, I couldn't spell algebra, let alone MBA. It was never going to be my game. So I wanted to get out and experience life. And that really led me to a whole series of searching for answers. And that really brings us to a central theme, I think, for where we are here, because that's really what we're looking to do. We're looking to search for answers and not be given the standard, parroted information that unfortunately falls under the dictate of that hypnotizes the masses. And that is, they confuse truth with popularity. And when you start falling into that mindset, you get blindsided by stuff that may sound good, but doesn't stack up under scrutiny. And really what I'm excited to be a part of here and with what we're doing is really to drill down and start to question something and a whole epoch of understanding around science that has just not been questioned at the level it should. And what I hope to do tonight for the benefit of the audience and the people that are watching is put into some layman's terms, as I say, as kind of the flip side of the coin to Tom, really what is it we're trying to do? What is it that this is all about? Now, okay, you can have delayed choice quantum eraser experiments and variations of double slit and all of the mathematics and algorithms and predictability stuff that goes with it. But ultimately, what are we aiming for? What is our outcome? What does it mean in real terms, day to day, moment by moment, to you and I in our lives, trying to pay the mortgage and moving forward? Because if you can bring it back to that level of understanding, then people have got buy-in. They know what it means to them. Unless you happen to have this quest that falls into more of a minority, which is more so to say where Tom's the expert, which is really just wanting to do good science for the sake of good science, so that you can uncover certain principles that make better sense now than they did 100 years ago. But for most people driving to work every day, that's not their primary focus. So what I'd like to do is try to be able to provide a context for what we're doing here, so people can really understand, what's it all about? Why all the fuss? Why the excitement? Over some science experiments, because I never got excited about science experiments in school unless they were blowing stuff up, because that was cool, right? So what does it mean? So, for me, if you'll permit me, probably a good place to start for the audience is to really throw some context in from my perspective as to what this is all about and why is it important and what are we trying to do? Because if I can make sense in my own mind of that, maybe I can get some agreement or overlap with some of the understanding of other lay people like myself, and that'll give a lot more I guess buy into what some of the explanations that Tom's doing without us getting too lost in the mix. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Vanessa, if you've got people that are asking questions, then I'm sure that they can we can get to that. But for me, I think the important point here is to say, just to give context, and certainly from my perspective, as I say, as a layman, why am I throwing my weight behind this? Why am I excited to get on board? And I think for that, I really want to go back. Why is it important? Let's set the stage. For the vast majority of recorded human history, we didn't have the sciences. We had the predominant truth provider, which was religion. And the reason for that is because, there were so many things about life that we couldn't explain. And, when it rained, we wondered why. Was God mad, and was he, crying? Or was he rewarding us by filling up the rivers? We didn't know. So what do we do when we don't know? We make stuff up. Essentially, we try to fill in the gap, because man is the consummate explorer, and therefore we find it hard to live in the space of a question, and we're always looking to seek and add meaning. Now, today, we have a different understanding. We understand evaporation, precipitation, we understand gravity, and we know what rain is, to the point where we can predict it pretty accurately. And it still may ruin your barbecue, it still may ruin your head if you come out of a salon in a downpour, but we don't look up and get scared anymore. Right. There's a difference there. And a lot of what happened when the church and the religion and the whole aspect of trying to explain things we couldn't explain really took on that role of trying to give us answers, either so we weren't scared or so that we could try to understand at some level. Now, again, you fast forward then through after many centuries, and you start getting people saying, well, something, the guy in a cloud deal isn't working for me anymore. We need to have some higher level of understanding about what it is. And, you had some of the great minds, starting with the Greeks, but, it really sort of started picking up pace right from, really Galileo or Copernicus into Galileo. The year Galileo dies, Sir Isaac Newton is born. And you have Newton and his contemporaries did something miraculous. Through observation and the right intent, they were able to essentially reverse engineer a lot of the rules that governed the celestial bodies and the physical world. And they were so good at doing it that they were able to figure out the rule set that allowed us to predict. And it was that level of accurate prediction that gave it credibility. And everyone says, wow, we've sussed it out. And what it also did, it says, we don't need the church's explanation anymore that there's this big, all-powerful guy that has wrath over and domain everything that clicked his fingers and made it happen. That doesn't work for us now because we've got science. Now, the important point to note here is right from the very beginning, science and theology, mythology, and religion were at loggerheads. They were on two separate paths. Science was trying to dismiss the church, and church was trying to retain its significance and dismiss science and sort of retain its domain over the metaphysical, while it kind of let science, have the physical. But in order for science to retain its level of significance and position, it essentially had to dismiss the metaphysical. Right? So they had these two diverging paths. I mean, now we know they're kind of different ways of telling the same story, as we'll get onto. But ultimately, they were at loggerheads from the beginning. And that's a big important point. So where do we find ourselves? Well, for quite a while, Science was then provided the answers to the sane intellect, the left brain level of reality. And it happened to, or deliberately ignored everything to do with non-physical, to the point where it relied upon its entire model to dismiss it. The challenge with that, it completely ignored a lot of the fundamental questions that still to this day, science has absolutely no answer for, or unfortunately, interest in answering. And I'll give you some examples here, because once we peel back the onion a little bit, people can start to get an understanding, right? Because from science's perspective, just to put it in a nutshell here, when it came along and figured out how all of the material stuff worked with supreme precision to the point we can put a man on the moon, it essentially stood in the middle of a giant Swiss watch, looked around and figured out the patterns. It doesn't address why the watch was built, who built the watch, what built it, or what time is, or what purpose it serves. Right? Forget that. It essentially said the universe is stupid. It is made up of dumb atoms, and elements like hydrogen and electrons that kind of have no governing intelligence, and they bash into each other randomly, and they kind of create the world we're in, even though they operate by certain rules that have become easy to figure out. This was supported back in the 1800s by Charles Darwin, who essentially came up with his whole theory of survival of the fittest, and his evolution model was essentially that random chance and mutation is what governs evolution moving forward. And that randomness was supported by the whole randomness of the universe. There's no intelligence that's kind of governing it. And so, materialism, determinism was born out of that to some extent. And it's saying, well, okay, the universe is dumb and we are separate from it. And if we exist or we don't exist, then it doesn't matter. The universe carries on. And that is kind of the aspect of determinism. And that's the prevailing thought patterns behind science today. It's what is taught in schools and colleges and universities. And it's the only paradigm that would, can essentially be published with any sense of credibility into the journals that validate credibility, irrespective of the fact that everything that science proved kind of existed before science proved it. But to retain its own level of significance around that, it needs a rubber stamp. Challenge is this. Again, this is a throwback to the loggerheads with the church. It has to stick with there is nothing else outside of the physical paradigm, not down to assessing data. It's got nothing to do with the evidence. It's got everything to do with standing steadfast in its initial position against the church. And that's essentially the overriding factor people forget. So what are some of the questions we could ask here that would really allow the average person to see what we're trying to do? Well, I think the average, 7-year-old starts to ask pretty, awkward questions to scientists, or parents. Questions like, well, how big is the universe? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer science's current interpretation right now, and so you can see why it's time to change, right? Because it's just not good enough. It doesn't answer the questions. How big is the universe? Well, it's infinite, but we're not exactly sure what that means. It means it doesn't end, but we have no explanation for what that actually means in physical world. Where did it come from? Well, it exploded from nothing. It was a primordial atom that decided to evolve, explode, and it kept doubling in size. It was infinitely dense, infinitely hot. We can predict what happened to 1/10 to 1/4 to a quintillionth of a second, 10 to the 34th power. But and we can tell you, pretty precisely what the physics was around that. But we have absolutely no idea why it happened or what created it. In other words, translation, it magicked out of nothing. How did we get here? Oh, well, we evolved through the random mutation, and at some point, consciousness was born as part of that process. Oh, but we have absolutely no theories as to how that happens. In other words, no clue. And you can take all of the physical aspects of materialism, from any part of biology, any amino acid combination, any bioorganic matter, and you can whirl it around in test tubes forever, and you'll still never generate consciousness. Right? So what we'll do is we'll ignore that for now. Oh, well, can consciousness actually affect the physical world? Oh, no, absolutely not. That doesn't work. But we'll ignore all of the times that it does, right? Which has been done repeatedly under many different experiments and is enshrined in law if you look at the placebo effect. And I know Tom talks about this, but it's actually, if you can outperform your mind's own ability to override your body chemistry, then we'll give you a license and grant you FDA approval. So it's unbelievable that the main biggest questions: who are we? Why are we here? Where do we come from? What is consciousness? Where did the universe come from? I mean, think about it. The very fundamental bedrock that materialism stands on is the most indefensible paradigm and hypothesis you could ever come up with. What do I mean by that? Well, what they're essentially saying is everything that we perceive outside of us is separate from us, but we'll never be able to prove that, because by the very definition of proving it, we have to be part of that process. So materialism itself is fundamentally flawed at its roots from day one. Why? Oh, well, I'll prove that it's separate. Well, the only way you can prove something is separate is by if you measure it. And if you measure it, you're part of it. So it can never be done. Right? They tend to forget that. You know? Right? And the mantra that comes with it is almost getting old. It's like, listen, give me one free miracle, right, which is the universe magicked out of nothing, and that'll mean that I will then explain to you why you're not allowed to have any more miracles. Right? I mean, give me a break. Right. And so, there's the fundamental real questions here. And again, I'm not knocking materialism to the point where, it's given us an understanding and a grasp of the physical world that has allowed us to live a life that our ancestors dreamed about. Yeah, kudos to Newton and his contemporaries and all of the people that have built on the shoulders of his work. That, I flew in from the US today. That wouldn't have happened if we didn't understand the material levels of physics. Right, trust me, I wouldn't be getting on that plane. So, but if the point is, if that's where it stops and there is a fundamental belief block that prevents us from moving further and beyond that to answer the biggest questions of why are we here? What is life about? What is consciousness? How did it evolve? How can mind affect reality when we know it does? Then it's time for us to question this whole paradigm that isn't enshrined in science. And I say that with this caveat, right? Materialism is not enshrined in science under the rules of science, because the rules of science state that you should continually evolve and modify and improve your hypothesis based upon what the data is consistently showing, rather than what we found for the last 100 years is that no, because of the initial loggerheads with the church, right, we will retain our domain and our death grip on materialism and a dumb universe, right? And we will ignore all of the data that challenges that hypothesis. That's not science, guys. I'm sorry. It's time for a new way of thinking. I'll quote Cicero. One of my favorite quotes. He said, why do you insist that the universe is not a conscious intelligence when it clearly gives birth to conscious intelligences? Step into my common sense corner for a second. So what we're actually doing here, and why I'm excited to be part of this with that level of backdrop, is not to bash materialism. As I say, it allowed me to fly here today. I'm very grateful for it. What we're looking to do is to raise the bar of science by saying, look, guys, it's time for us to not sort of ignore factual data that's leading us to better conclusions that do better physics, that answer the hard questions that science wants to bury its head in the sand for. And as a result of that, we have some significant implications. So, if we can just allow people to be a little more open-minded rather than closed-minded, and we can do that not with philosophy, there's enough philosophers in the world, right? Not with hyperbole, there's enough people that just want to attack and defend their own position, but with good data and experiments that it lead to further inquiry and allow us to have some strong basis of understanding that, look, what the material world is actually telling us is to open this door and look further down this corridor, not slam it shut and put our head in the sand. And right. I think Tom knows, as I know, as you know, Tom, that if that door is opened and we do venture down it, it's a Pandora's box of understanding that can really lead to making the world a better place, which is what everybody has an interest in, rather than a more hostile place, which is kind of where determinism has put us right now. Yeah, why do I say that? Go back to the Darwinian paradigm. If you follow the Darwinian paradigm, survival of the fittest, yeah, materialism, external world separate from internal world, I, by definition, as a separatist, means that I am fearful of anything that could threaten me on the outside. It is a fear-based reality. It is a fear-based model of the world. Yeah, where does love come into that? And, as you heard Tom and myself say before, love is the ultimate destination once you open that other door, not from an idealistic, let's hold hands and sing Pollyanna perspective, but from a fundamental factual perspective of where evolution is trying to take us, as evidenced on fossil records for the last 400 million years.
Well,
so with that
so
with that basis and that kind of context, I really wanted to just open it up to the audience so they could understand really why I'm excited about this. It's not to bash materialism. It's not to just, say, hey, this is cool. We live in a virtual reality. That's what the physics says. No, it's the wider implications of how you, me, the people down the street, the people on the other side of the border, can shift from a fear-based mentality to a fundamental understanding as to why we're here and a more love-based mentality. And that's why I'm excited.
Yeah, I think you must be a good golfer because you just teed up the first question we have quite well that I've been watching. Vanessa, why don't you go ahead and talk about the first question, because Peter, what you just addressed is exactly where we're headed with this.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you everybody for chiming in. A lot of people are pointing out that they love your haircut, Tom. You look very And Michael here is saying that he has a question regarding unconditional love. He says, here's a hypothetical situation. Let's say that someone is kidnapped. They took your daughter, they raped her and brutally murdered her. How do you show unconditional love to this murderer? Is it necessary to still even show unconditional love in that situation? Or is it necessary to show everyone unconditional love regardless of their behavior?
I'm happy to chime in on that. And Tom, if you want to as well, but feel free.
Go ahead, Peter. I'll go after you.
Cool. The basis, the conclusion that we get to when you follow this model is essentially we're in what I call Earth School. Now, what you've pulled out there is one of the toughest exams you could ever pass in Earth School. Yeah, we're not here to pass the exams at the highest level. Otherwise, once we do, there's no longer a need to come back. Yeah. If you were of the kind of caliber of the person where you could express unconditional love to somebody that went and did that, then you probably don't need to come back. Am I at that level? I'd find that very hard. However, look at the gradients. Everything is direction of travel. I had a situation where a partner of mine was drugged and raped by two guys. And when I found out about that, it was before I was with her, but when I found out about that, it was just at the point where I was going through my spiritual practice of understanding and looking at forgiveness. Life will give you a test, just as school will give you a test. It took me many days of wrestling with myself not to want to throttle this guy, or whatever, go and just have that emotional reaction. Why? I'm human. But I got to a point where I understood the bigger picture. And this was tough for me. It was a graduation event, as I call it. And I could get to a point where I could make a separation of what somebody does, i.e. their behavior, and who they are. Who somebody is and their behavior are two different things. And forgiving somebody is not the same as condoning the behavior. That's another big mistake that prevents a lot of people from getting to forgiveness. Just because if you think you forgive someone, you make it right what they did. No, that isn't the case. So you're picking a very typical cherry picker, the outlier example here. If you were to say, should you show unconditional love to somebody that cut you up in traffic, that's a different conversation. That's the level of kindergarten exam that a lot of people could learn to pass quite easily. Somebody kidnaps and does something horrible to somebody you care about, that's further up the gradient in terms of conscious levels of evolution. When Jesus says turn the other cheek, he wasn't coming from a place of weakness. It was a strength beyond a strength. But depending on where you are in your own journey, you're going to approach it a different way. I'll give a very quick example for context, and I'll throw it over to Tom. One of the most powerful words in the English language is the word surrender. But depending on where you are on your own level of consciousness, you're going to hear that from different places. If you're a US Marine, you're not going to hear the word surrender from a place of strength. Yeah, you're going to hear it from a place of, screw you, right? Yeah, and fix bayonets. If you're at a higher level of consciousness, you're going to hear the word surrender to, surrendering to the wisdom of the current of life. Yeah, to stop resisting what is, to learn from the challenges, to be able to move forward. There's a conscious non-resistance to that. At a higher level of consciousness, you're going to be surrendering to the inevitability of what life is at this level of non-duality and unconditional love. It's a reflection of where you are on your journey. And I'll say this, my friend, whoever you are that asked the question, one of the things that'll really help you along on the journey, that helped me, was realizing that all people can ever do is project from the level of consciousness they're at. And it's not going to be your level, it's not going to be my level. Yeah, people do things for reasons. They're not going to be your reasons, they're not going to be my reasons, but they'll project from the level they're at. And when you understand that, if that expresses itself in being able to kidnap and torture somebody, right, then one has to come to the conclusion that if you are operating at that level of consciousness, with that belief system, with that model of the world, with that cultural upbringing, significant emotional events, and that whatever was going on in your world at the time, you would have done the same thing. And until you can get and accept to that place, you have no right to judge it. Yeah, but again, that's a progress in terms of through the different levels of school. And I've certainly got quite a few to go through myself. So that's kind of my take on that. Tom, feel free to jump in.
Okay. First off, Peter, I agree with all the things that you said. You gave a good answer as far as the practical applications, how and why one deals with things like that. I'm going to approach it from almost the opposite end. And so that way I won't repeat the things you said. First of all, this philosophy of becoming love is not a pacifist philosophy. This philosophy does not say that there is never a time to stand up and fight. There's never a time, to not turn the other cheek. There are times when that is necessary. What this is about is evolving the quality of your consciousness, growing up. Okay, we call that growing up, becoming love, lowering your entropy. Okay, you have to look at this lowering entropy, which is the same as, moving toward becoming love. You have to look at that in the long term. So we have some kind of a situation, and you should always ask yourself, what's the low entropy interaction that I can have with this situation? Okay, and that is a long-term thing, not just for this next 2 minutes or just for me, but the long-term entropy reduction for the system, for everybody. All right, so now if you see that you are in a position to stop somebody from, marauding other people, stealing babies' candy, raping and pillaging, if you are in a position to prevent that, then the low entropy solution is to prevent that, you see? Okay, now, you have to realize that most of the time, the great majority of the times that you are in unpleasant situations, the right answer is to turn that other cheek for all the reasons that Peter just told you. It is the unusual time, the very 1,000th of 1% time when you're in a situation where your action, perhaps your violence, is necessary to prevent the increase of entropy, not only to yourself, but to many, many other people. So this is not a pacifist ideology. And I don't say that, you have to enjoy watching your daughter being raped and murdered and whatever, and say, well, that's just the way life is. We just need to puck up and keep on going. No, that would probably be a pacifist philosophy. That's not what this is. What we're doing is trying to evolve ourselves toward a low entropy being. That is a being of love. And on that path, sometimes we have to stand up for ourselves, and more often for others. Okay, you have a wife and family. You're going to protect them. And if that means you have to get violent in a case to do that, then you will. And that may be the low entropy solution. On the other hand, if you're just spoiling for a fight and you don't like people who are different than you are, and you'd like to have what they have, then that's not a low entropy solution. That's not a good path to take. So every event, every situation you come to is different and unique. And the one that this question asker asked, he, like you say, he cherry picked one out of the far end of the possibilities that probably doesn't happen to many of us ever, but does happen sometimes to some people. But you have to look at every situation differently. I mean, if they're all unique, this idea that there's this morality code that one answer fits all things, you know, never be violent, you know, never whatever, never you know, always turn the other cheek, never and always just don't work in the real world. You have to look at the situation, and when the situation calls for it, it's time to stand up and, you know, say no more if that's what's called for. Most of the time what's called for is, as Peter described, most of the time, that other 99.999% of the time, it's called for you to understand, for you to realize that everybody on this planet is trying to do the best they can with what they've got. That's what Peter was describing. You have to have compassion, you have to have understanding, and you have to realize that by being forceful, by being violent, by enforcing your free will on others, almost always just throws gasoline on that fire. It makes it worse. It's not a solution. It's, in the long term, it's a very high entropy solution. So you behave yourself, you are in such a way as you have a low entropy outcome. And that almost always is by caring, by you know, by seeing it from the other person's viewpoint. That's usually the low entropy solution, but not always. In rare circumstances, the way of a low entropy solution, the way to love, is to stand your ground, stand up, and protect those that deserve protection. So it's not a general thing. You can't just say, well, this philosophy says you should always do this and always do that. Any philosophy that says always and never probably isn't a good philosophy, because life doesn't work that way. You have to have a brain. You have to have an understanding. You have to see what is a high entropy and low entropy thing. And you only do that by growing up yourself. As you become love, it's easier for you to distinguish between when you should fight and when you should turn the other cheek. Up until you grow up, that's kind of chancy, and you often do it wrong. And if you do it wrong, look at the results. If you've just added fire to what, you know, added fuel to the fire, then try to do it differently next time.
I've always said, I always believe you should never say always and never. That's one of my philosophies. We got some more questions coming in from the audience. Vanessa, what have we got?
Yes, so we have a question here from TT. The very first question that came in. TT was also there at your MBT LA event, so she was there to watch the description of all the experiments that we are raising money for. So TT says, "Hi Tom, I have a question for you about a paradigm shift and how it might play out. What do you think will happen if the experiments will turn out the way that you predict? Would it be top news, or maybe too scary for media to publish? Or is there any other procedure to spread this kind of information once it is ready to be shared?"
Well, I think it is, if they come out the way, if all of them come out the way I say, you know, I don't expect that, but that would be fantastic. I think the ones that are, what I say, are going to perform the miracles, are going to do things that are impossible to do, which is really the big ones that are going to make a difference. I think those will work just fine. I think some of the others, which are just mainly for me to learn something, to see how things work, how the system is going to respond to the challenge that we give it with these experiments, those may or may not work the way I say, but they're not really the most important part, other than from, you know, for what I learned from it. But if it wasn't true that a large minority of physicists already think virtual reality is a good idea, then I think there might be a problem. You know, if this was the first time virtual reality raised its head, I suspect it would have a tendency to be buried again. But now we have 20-30% of the physicists think that virtual reality, that is, that our reality is based on information, is a good idea, because that's what the evidence has been telling us, as Peter said, for 100 years. That's been what the evidence says. That's the only thing that seems to make sense. It's the only thing that works. So, and I also notice that when you have these conferences and talks that we see on YouTube every once in a while, where virtual reality is discussed by its supporters in the physics community, almost always those physicists that are up there on that panel discussing it, and for virtual reality, they think, yes, this reality is based on information. They all come from the very best schools. You're talking, about Caltech, and you're talking about MIT, and you're talking about some of the best ones in Europe. That's where these guys mostly come from. So I've noticed that the physicists who are really at the top of their game, really doing good work, particularly if they're younger, they think virtual reality is a good idea, you see. So with that as a background, I think if these experiments work pretty much the way I say, it will be big news. I don't think at this point it can be, brushed under any rug. I think the ideas will be announced. My experiments will be done by many other universities just to see if they get the same thing, to make sure that there weren't any errors or other problems. And when all that's done, I think the news will be large. And what I think it means to the world is that if indeed we have physical experiments that show that this reality is information-based, it's virtual, then that opens up a really big question, because virtual realities don't just make themselves. They don't create themselves. They have to be created. Virtual reality means that information is computed. Where does the information come from? It doesn't just pop out of the air when needed. It has to be computed. Computed where? Computed by who? You see, all these questions will pop up. Whether the physicists stop and ask them or not, at that point will be irrelevant. Millions of other people who catch the news on the internet, they will be asking those questions, and suddenly something that is more fundamental than us, something from which we are derived, you see, exists from the very viewpoint of science. Just as Peter told you, this is something that science has been trying to avoid, that will not say, will not support, will not look at. Well, here it is. There's no way not to look at it, you see. So it takes that step where physicists and scientists have been looking the other way for hundreds of years. They just don't want to go there. That's not what they do, and they make fun of anybody who does go there and what they do. And at this point, if these experiments work as I say, that will force a change in that paradigm, and physicists will have to look at this reality coming from someplace else that is non-physical to us, because that's the only logical possibility if this is a virtual reality. Virtual realities cannot create themselves. They have to be created elsewhere, and they have to be created by something that's someplace other than inside the virtual reality, which means someplace that's non-physical to us. So I think these will be very big news. And though the scientists still won't want to go there, it won't matter. Once that genie's let out of the bag, and 1 billion people around the world get that information, whether the physicists want to go further down that rabbit hole or not will be irrelevant. Everybody else will. And now we'll be looking for solutions to, how did it get there? Why are we here? What's the point of the virtual reality? What's the source, this non-physical source? These questions are going to be serious questions now. Rather, before, they were just hypothetical metaphysics that nobody had to pay any attention to because, that stuff doesn't count anyway. Well, all of that changes. Now that stuff does count, you see, and lots of people will know it. So I believe it'll start a revolution worldwide in people's thinking. And I'm hoping that revolution will end up with us realizing that our purpose here is to grow up, become more low entropy, and that means become love. Care about each other. Stop being so self-centered. Have compassion for others. That's the way consciousness evolves in that direction. So I think it'll make a big bang, TT. I believe that this is the beginning of a very large shift in the way people think, a very large paradigm shift. Matter of fact, I think the paradigm shift is going to be so large that I think you could take the shift with Galileo and Newton and Einstein and Bohr and multiply it by 10. And this new shift is going to be bigger than all of that. This is going to be one that's going to shake things worldwide because now we have an internet. See, before, great things have been discovered, but like the quantum mechanics and the double slit, there's probably isn't more than 2% of the population that even knows what that is. You see, these kinds of things stay bottled up in the margins. They don't get out. But this thing that we're talking about now, virtual reality, will jump out of those margins and become something that is pervasive because it makes a big difference to us. Who are we? Why are we here? What's our purpose? That's big stuff. Like Peter says, people have been asking those questions, since people existed. And now we're to a point where those answers are starting to turn up, and turn up as science, not as religion, and not as, things that you make up, but of, experiment-based science. So I think a big difference, TD.
Tom, you just teed up my next transition, which is big news. I forgot to mention off the top that we're, I believe, around 115K with over 2 weeks to go, which doesn't mean that we slow down. I see we did get some backers during the show, so I'm excited to see how that goes. If I remember correctly, we had 7 $10,000 packages available, and 4 of them have already sold out. So we've got 3 more. So if you're thinking, go in and go sign up for one of the $10,000 backers today. We're so close and yet so far, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, it feels like every day I check it and I think, oh, we're almost there, but we're not there. So we got to just kind of keep trudging through. And there won't be big news if we don't get this thing funded. So I want to go back to Vanessa now because I see the chat room lighting up. Looks like we got a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have another question here from Wanma. Wanma is asking about the experiments, and he's asking for more clarification, saying this might sound silly, this question, but he wants to understand if this is basically trying to find glitches in the virtual reality, and what if whoever is running this virtual reality is aware of us trying to test the simulation hypothesis, and then they patch up those glitches to hide the truth.
Well, it's not really to find glitches. That's not the point. There is a rule set, and the virtual reality is computed according to that rule set. Now, what I'm trying to do with the experiments is basically back let's call it just the virtual reality rendering engine. I'm trying to back that into a corner so that however it tries to escape from that corner, it's got to leave behind a little bit of information that tells us a little more about how reality works. See, we did that already with the double slit. When people were clever enough to put one particle at a time, shoot one particle at a time at that slits, well, that put the system between a rock and a hard place. Now, what was it going to do? You see, one particle at a time through those slits was a tough thing to do, but when we did it, it put the system between a rock and a hard place. And what it decided to do was keep this reality consistent, which means it made those one particle at a time configure themselves in a diffraction pattern so there wouldn't be an inconsistency between particles and waves. So it patched up a boundary problem that otherwise would have been a kind of a break, you see. And I'm guessing it's going to continue to do that. It's going to continue to try to make this reality a smooth, predictable, no conflicts. What I'm talking about is you can't have a reality that has certain facts that contradict each other. If it's a certain fact of this reality, then all other certain facts it has to get along with. When you have 2 certain facts that each deny the other's existence, but they both exist, you have a problem, you see, and the system doesn't want those kinds of problems. So I'm likewise trying to put it in a corner, and how it's going to get out of that corner, it's going to have to leave some interesting information behind to do it. So that's the point. It's not really a glitch. Now, could the system somehow go around that and do something else to kind of cover it up? I'm sure it could. But one of the other things I'm counting on is that the system always computes efficiently. Okay, in computing language, that's called parsimoniously. Okay, with the code needs to be as clean and as less redundant and as efficient as possible. So with that as one of my assumptions going in, that the system is going to try to remain consistent and that it's going to do it with computation that's parsimonious, then that's the trap I'm setting for it, hoping to back it into a situation where it's going to have to give up some secrets in order to actually do this experiment. And same thing that happened with double slit, except these I'm asking it to give up some secrets that are even a little more amazing than the ones with the double slit. So we'll see. Could it cover it up? Yes, but I don't think it will. It's pretty well abides by the rule set, and I don't see that it has a purpose in trying to keep us from understanding the nature of reality. In fact, I think that it has a purpose to help us understand the nature of reality.
Well, Tom, if I'd actually like to speak to that for a second, because I think one of the first questions I ever asked you when I got to know you was this question. And you'd mentioned, I said, well, wouldn't they be able to cover this up? And I believe part of your response was that's not the intention. They have no intention. That at some point we are essentially supposed to come to this point. Is that correct?
Absolutely. This is part of our growth. We're evolving here as consciousness, and part of our evolution is to become aware of who we are and why we're here. That's part of it. If we're going to grow up to become love, if we're going to grow up to care about other, well, it helps to know that we're in a virtual reality trainer, if you will, to do just that. If everything else makes sense, then this idea about be nice, love everybody, is not just a nice sounding thing that seems to make us all happier. It's actually a scientific part of a logical process for the evolution of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So it wants us to understand this reality, but not until we're ready. You see, until you're ready, you just will abuse it rather than use it. Information can be abused, or it can be used profitably, just like anything else, just like a weapon. You can use it to defend yourself and defend the innocent, or you can use it to, to foist your ego and your free will on other people. Well, it's the same thing. Information can be used either way. So as we grow up, as we're ready for this, then we need to understand it. So it's not like, we're supposed to be kept in the dark and ignorant all the time. We're supposed to find out. We're supposed to have to learn, to grow and figure this out. That's part of our thing here. And now we're at the point where the system, I believe, is saying, you're ready. Let's figure it out. Let's go forward. Let's more people figure it out.
Well, I'm going to try to keep us on pace here. I want to grab one more question from the audience, Vanessa, and then Peter, I'd like to circle back to you and actually see if you have a question for Tom. But Vanessa, why don't you get us one more from the audience?
Yeah, there's a lot of technical questions here. And guys, I'm not a techie, so it's challenging for me to go through and sort that out. I'm more of a practical. So maybe, Tom, I'll ask you a practical question around understanding our purpose here and wanting to help create this global paradigm shift. What is it that we can do, we the people, what can we do to help this momentum and help it move in the right direction?
Well, the very obvious thing, the reason why we're here today, what you could do to help us move this thing forward is donate to this Kickstarter program, because then these experiments would actually get done. And until they get done, then there's only so much hand waving and conjecture that everybody can make, but there really isn't any truth points. You see, you need experiments create facts. Mm-hmm. And until you get facts, all you have is opinion. So we need to get these experiments done to learn what are facts and what aren't. And these won't be the last of the experiments. Whenever you do an experiment, however it comes out, it usually makes you think about what the next experiment needs to be to move your understanding a little further. So we'd really like to get this started off, because if we can get science to see this in a real serious way, then funding for later experiments will be easy, because it will already have proven itself, you see. So this is the kickoff. This is the thing that gets the ball rolling. So that's what you can do as far as helping this effort. What you can do as far as helping the world, what you can do to actually save the world, is start getting rid of your fear, start letting go of your ego, let those beliefs go, become skeptical, grow up, and become actually a much happier, much fulfilled, much more successful person. That sounds like a no-winner, right? I mean, a no-brainer. I mean, you ought to be able to, that'd be a good thing to do. So just grow up, get rid of your fear. That's the thing you can do, because that's where we're going.
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing is, since I came across this model and this understanding of the nature of reality, it's helped me become a much happier person. Like you often say, when you know the game, when you know the rules of the game, it's a lot easier to play it, right? So
yeah,
I'm having fun with it now. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think everybody that's on this we have this all volunteer crew that's been working. And I think one of the things that's been fun for all of us is that we all have, kind of found this approach that I think that in for me at least, and Vanessa, this is probably true for you too. This was stuff that was floating around in my consciousness already, and then Tom, I discovered what Tom was saying. I was like, this guy is saying stuff that's already been spinning in my head. I had a real strong connection with it. I'm quite happy to see that we've got people like Peter who are joining us on this as well. And before I forget again, we do actually, Tom recorded a wonderful thing addressing these technical issues. I've listened to it twice. I'm back to back. Love the thing. It's on our page. You can check that out. But for the last question, I wanted to give Peter, give you a little leeway here to have the honor to ask the last question here.
Gotcha. Well, for me, just to chime in on what Vanessa was saying as part of the crew as well, what's been most satisfying for me is really, again, being given a model that Tom's brought to the world that provides context for the deepest level of meaning. Yeah, that has shifted your fundamental relationship to life. One of the things I'm most excited about supporting this campaign for, and something that I share with the audience here, is that I want to be able to tell my kids, 20 years from now, that I was able to leave a little thumbprint in some way on the ability to make that transition. As somebody who wants to grow up, who's somebody who's on a path of personal growth and trying to get rid of my ego and hopefully learn my lessons as I go. That's an opportunity that just doesn't come along. So whether you've got an interest in quantum mechanics or whether you can't even spell it, whether you've got whether it's all about proving virtual reality or whether that's just over your head, is almost irrelevant. To be part of something that can add that much value to the world, and in a way that allows laymen like myself to, as I say, leave a little thumbprint on to make a difference for the greater good, is an opportunity I couldn't pass up, and that's the reason why I'm here. So I guess my final question from me to Tom is that if you were to address people who were either getting caught up on the details or were looking for whether they should or shouldn't sort of be involved or stand on the sidelines, what is the magnitude here of being able to make it real for them? Not just look at what the data is, because I'll be honest, I probably won't be able to interpret half the data, but I want to support it because I know you can and I know what it'll mean. So speaking to the average person in the street, that for the sake of getting a signed book, for the sake of being able to wear a T-shirt saying I was part of this thing, what would you say to those?
Well, what is really fundamentally important here is that we move forward, we evolve, we grow up. What's fundamentally forward here isn't so much about the physics. The physics is just a means of getting there. Physics is a step in the process. We have to bring the scientists along because they are the ones that tell everybody else what's true and what's not. So the physics part is necessary, but that's not really what it's all about. What it's all about is giving people a theory, to give people a structure in which they can understand themselves and others at a fundamental level where joy and peace and happiness lives, at a fundamental level that is positive. If you kind of follow this path of growth and evolving the quality of your consciousness, you'll see everything in your life get better. Your relationships will get better. Your connections with all other people will get better. You will get happier. Your life will get more peaceful. Your anger and upset and stress will start to go away. This is what it's really all about. It's growing up. It's trying to make the world a better place. And the world can only be made a better place, not through better laws and better, institutions. those things will just happen if we have better people. So we start with better people, and the institutions and the politicians and the corporations will all change as we, the people, change, because they're just a reflection of us. So that's really the big news here, not the physics. The physics is just a step that you have to go through on the path of making this legitimate. But you don't have to go there. There's literally thousands and thousands of people who take this material without any physics and change their life with it. You know, it's a life-changing set of ideas. All those experiences you have, both objective and subjective, suddenly become understandable. You know what it means, why it's there. Why are these things happening to me? You know, why am I unhappy? Why is my life a struggle? And it all becomes perfectly clear. So that is really what it's about. That's the important thing. Physics is a way stop, a way to create credibility among the masses. First, you have to get the high priests of Western culture, the scientists, to sign off on it. Otherwise, it'll stay in the margins. That's why we're here doing physics experiments. Not because physics experiments will save the world, because physics experiments will help get the word out to a lot of people who then, by changing themselves, will save the world. So that's really what it's about.
Yeah, it was like from what do they say, from your lips to God's mouth, or whatever. That's exactly the way it felt for me when I first, stumbled onto Tom's stuff. That I was going through some sort of struggles at that time, and I discovered it, and I noticed that once I started really, taking a look and listening to what he had to say, I was like, wow, this is actually, you're right, Tom. The physics, that's the great part we can look into, but the effects that it has on the way you see not only your life, but your life in relation to, us as a collective consciousness, really fundamentally changes. So I'm hoping we'll get that remaining few dollars left. We're getting awfully close with that. I think about 115K. Just a couple of quick reminders that we are still active. We still have a couple of weeks. We will be posting this video on YouTube. So if you're one of Tom's YouTube people, you can watch it over and over again, like I always seem to do. And Peter, I believe your website is petersage.com. Is that correct?
Yes, and I'll put it on my YouTube channel as well. And as I say, I'd encourage everybody, if this resonates with you, if you really want to get behind and support us, you can do. Even if you've already backed, share it with your friends. Again, this is not imposing stuff onto other people. It's about sharing something that you believe in that can help make a difference, and and allowing people their free will to come on board or not, or just cheer for us. So everybody on here just was to share this amongst the people they know. Would be a lot closer to making this happen.
Okay, and I'd point out one other thing, Scott.
Yeah.
And that is, though it looks like we're doing really well because you're like halfway through in the time and about 3/4 through, in getting to our limit of 150K. But that's because we've had some really generous big donors. Normally, what we get is about $2,000 a day. $2,000 a day for the number of days we have left. Just almost gets us to the finish line, but not quite. So if you can't expect that these big donors are just going to keep popping up and giving us $10,000 a piece. Those are people who are very, very generous, who obviously can afford it and think it's important. You don't expect that. So if we do get some of those, well, that'll really help. But if we don't, and we keep the present trends of giving, it's going to be iffy whether we're going to make it or not. We're right, we're going to get close, but whether we're going to actually make it is not yet, clear. And if we don't make it, the rules are it all goes back. We get nothing. So we start over. So guys, don't expect big donors to pull this out at the end. They've probably already done everything they're going to do. It's been around for a while, and those guys have probably they've put their money where their mouth is, and they put a lot of money there. But I think the rest of us are going to have to carry it over the top. And that means we're going to have to do a little better and get a little more than that 2,000 a day, or we're not going to make it. So if you think if you want to be part of this historical, process, like Peter says, then $10, if that's all you can give, please give that. All those $10 add up. That's
Absolutely.
we can make it on $10 donations if enough people give them. So don't feel like $10 isn't worth the trouble. It is.
Always share and never don't share is the policy I try to take with the. See how I brought that back around? That's quick thinking. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. It's been fantastic having you. Tom, thank you once again for answering questions. We will be getting to more questions. There will be more live streams. I will be posting them. You see a little countdown clock on the page when I posted it 2 days in advance, so you will get a notice for that. Vanessa, thank you for engaging the audience, and especially thank you to the audience. We wouldn't even be really here if it wasn't for you. We need more of you out there, so share all this with your friends and family, and let's get this thing funded. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Well, everybody.